Good afternoon, and welcome to the third installment of the summer virtual book talks organized by the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. My name is Hisa Kuriyama, and I am the faculty director of the Humanities program at the Institute, and as well as the Reischauer Institute Professor of Cultural History at Harvard. Before we begin, I'd first like to thank the members of the Radcliffe Institute the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society, and all our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we are truly grateful. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome two acclaimed authors and former fellows of the Radcliffe Institute, Gish Jen and Margot Livesey. Gish is an award-winning writer and author of 5 novels and 2 books of nonfiction, as well as numerous short stories and other works which have appeared in anthologies and periodicals, including the New Yorker and the Atlantic Monthly. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is the recipient of a variety of fellowships and other honors. She's also a proud graduate of Radcliffe College, and she earned her MFA from the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. This afternoon, Gish will read from her latest book, The Resistors, which was published by Knopf in February of 2020. The Resistors is a dystopian tale set in the near future where jobs are automated, the land is partially submerged, and society is painfully divided and subject to the surveillance of a powerful internet-like entity. The family at the core of the story struggles to maintain their normalcy and humanity through everyday activities, including baseball. The daughter in the story is a pitching prodigy. Following her reading, Gish will converse with another award-winning author, Margot Livesey. Margot is the author of 8 novels, with a 9th, The Boy in the Field, coming out on August 11th from Harper Collins. Margot currently teaches at the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop, and she's taught previously at a variety of institutions, including BU, Bowdoin, Brandeis, Carnegie Mellon, Emerson, Tufts, UC Irvine, and Williams. After the conversation, Margot will open the virtual floor to discussion by selecting questions from among those raised by you, the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. We will simply ask that you keep your questions brief to allow Gish to address as many questions as possible in the time that we have together. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Gish Jen.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. I thought I'd start us off by saying a few words about how I came to write this post-automation surveillance state feminist baseball dystopia, a story that starts in the fall of 2017. You may imagine me standing in Harvard Yard. I've just helped my freshman daughter move into her dorm room in Canada, and like all empty nesters, I am despondent. I go home, I cry, I mope around. But then slowly it dawns on me that I now have control over my day for the first time in 28 years. Moreover, where I have just sat through freshman orientation and have heard over and over again how important it is to have fun and explore and take risks, it occurs to me that maybe I should have fun and explore and take risks. And so I sit down to write whatever I damn well please. But of course, even though I've just given myself express permission to write about whatever I want, lo and behold, I do not write a book about a girl's weekend in Paris involving devastatingly handsome men and designer drugs. Instead, I find myself writing a book about parents watching their daughter grow up and go off into the world. It is, unsurprisingly, a book full of the kind of worry parents feel when they say goodbye to their freshman children, including the tension many of us feel between wanting to give our children their freedom and worrying that they will avail themselves all too freely of their freedom. But it is not just a parent's worry that you see in the resistors. It is also the worry of a citizen, because in the fall of 2017, as I am sitting down, it is 10 months into the Trump presidency, and already I'm pretty concerned about the state of our democracy and the future of our freedom, so much so that the word Constitution does appear on page 1 of this book. I'm also pretty concerned about the future of our planet and of race relations and of technology. And a lot of this is in reaction to things that have just happened. In the fall of 2017, if you recall, we had just had a number of terrifyingly intense hurricanes, as well as a record-breaking number of wildfires. And around the same time, Facebook chatbots had begun to speak to each other in their own non-human language, freaking people out about AI. Then there was Trump pushing his border wall and his Muslim ban. He might as well have sponsored the program I call Ship Them Back in my book. More happily, inspired by Colin Kaepernick, NFL players did take a knee during the national anthem, giving rise, I'm sure, to the idea that a sporting event could be a site of political resistance, as it is in the resistors. And in the early part of the year, too, we had a record turnout at the Women's March, the pink hats of which I'm sure contributed to one form of resistance in my book, turning out to be knitting. I'm going to read you just one very short passage today to give you a taste of the book and a little more sense of how baseball figures in it. I should say before I begin that a lot of people have asked me about the baseball, and there are, of course, artistic reasons for it. Baseball is the great American game. It does have what Walt Whitman called the snap, go, fling of the American atmosphere. And as we can see by the importance to us to this day of things like Dr. Fauci throwing out the first pitch of the baseball season this year, baseball continues to have enormous emotional resonance for us. But beyond the artistic reasons for my use of baseball, there are personal reasons for it as well, starting with the fact that neither one of my children has ever had any interest in baseball whatsoever. My daughter is in the next room as I speak to you, and I think that she would attest, were she to come out, that were I to write anything that seemed to have anything whatsoever to do with her actual life, my head would roll. But as it happens, neither she nor my son has, to the best of my knowledge, ever managed to make a bat come into contact with a ball. And so baseball was safe writing territory for me. At the same time, it was very much part of my family culture growing up. I do come from a Chinese immigrant family for whom baseball was a portal to American life, as it is for many immigrants, meaning that my parents first performed being American, if you will, by going to baseball games and rooting for the Yankees and eating hot dogs. I don't think it's any coincidence that my brother went on to become a star pitcher in the city of Yonkers, New York, where we grew up. He was one of the very best young pitchers in the city, so much so that he was introduced to Tom Seaver. His coach told Seaver that we have this Chinese kid who can throw. And Tom Seaver did teach my brother to throw a curveball. Indeed, so important did baseball become to my family that when my mother died of COVID a couple of months ago, we did bury her with a Yankees cap. And now I'm going to read this very short section from the book. At this point in the book, Gwen, who, as he has told you, is a prodigy pitcher, has come to the point where she's actually going to be in the Olympics. And she and her teammates are looking at the China-Russian team that they're about to play, and they're terrified because the China-Russian team has been genetically modified, and that means, among other things, that they are all switch hitters. Perhaps all this was fear, pure and simple, on the part of Gwen's teammates. But feeding their obsession, of course, was the sense that baseball was more than a sport, that it was a crown jewel. There were people who said it wasn't even invented in America. There were people who pointed out it was mentioned by Jane Austen long before it was ever mentioned here. But if baseball took on a hallowed meaning, it took on that meaning in our American dreams. For was this not the level playing field we envisioned, the field on which people could show what they were made of? And didn't we Americans believe above all that everyone should have a real chance at that? Didn't we believe that with the good of the team at heart, something in us might just hit a ball off our shoe tops and send it sailing clear out of the park? If Gwen's teammates were playing Chime Russia for something, I thought, it was for this, for a chance to show, my mother would have said, that even if we all returned to the dirt and the wind and the rain, like the plants and the animals, we had a bigness in us, something beyond algorithms and beyond upgrades, something we were proud to call human, or so it seemed to me.
Gish, that was wonderful, thank you. I still have to track down that Jane Austen reference. I'm only on Mansfield Park so far. But
it's in Volcano Abbey.
But finding something beyond algorithms and upgrades seems even more important nowadays. The thing I have to ask is just the obvious question. This represents such a departure for you, Gish. Ever since your gorgeous first novel, Typical American, you've been known as a chronicler of the American dream, usually through the lens of an immigrant, and always in the realistic mode. So I just have to ask, was it nerve-wracking to be trying to do something so different? Why a novel set in the future? Was the world building difficult, or was it fun, or was it both? And I'm also interested in that you draw on several different genres, the dystopian novel, the feminist novel, the baseball novel, and probably several I'm not thinking of. So was it hard?
Oh, thank you. Let me say, first of all, of course, that I'm not the first realistic novelist to turn to dystopian form right now. There are people who are real dystopian novelists, and then there are accidental dystopian novelists, and I am definitely in the second category. As to why I've turned to dystopian novel, of course, it's because we are living in a dystopia. And I was interested, in where we're going, and do we want to go there? And so therefore, it's very natural to set a novel in the future. Naturally, Margot, as you know very well, what we do with these books is we just we see a cliff that's sort of looking interesting, and we kind of jump off it. We often don't think really about what exactly we have done until we're actually midair. And that was true for me. I think it was some time before I realized, actually, since I'm writing in the future, I'm doing a lot of world building. And it wasn't really, I was probably halfway through before I even thought, well, wow, why is it so easy for me? Because it was really easy for me. And it wasn't until I kind of had a moment to think about it that I realized that, I actually read a lot of science fiction when I was in junior high school. In fact, the first literary magazine that I ever subscribed to was Fantasy and Science Fiction. It is a very interesting moment because, I was reading science fiction at a time when it had become respectable. And as Isaac Asimov said, the dropping of the atom bomb, very sadly, made science fiction respectable, just as Trump has made dystopia respectable. Do you know what I mean? There's a way in which it's moved into the mainstream because of the political events of the time. But anyway, there I was growing up in the shadow of the Cold War, and that meant that, I was reading Asimov and Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke, all these post-apocalyptic things like A Canticle for Leibowitz. And And to my amazement, all of that junior high school reading was still there. And so the world building was very easy. As you said, I also borrowed from the baseball novel in this book, and that was interesting. It's the first time I've done anything that had anything even slightly genre-like in it. And I could see both what's easy about genre writing and what's hard. What's easy is that, you know where you're going. As you know, Margot, we don't actually know where we're going. There's that very famous E.L. Doctorow quote about really being only able to see as far as, it's like driving a car at night and you can only see as far as your headlights. And most of the time, most of my writing I have done in that state. If you're actually working with something like a baseball novel, you actually know where you're going. You know there's going to be a big game at the end. And that actually makes things much easier. Now I can see why they can turn these books out very quickly, because they know where they're going. What's hard about it, though, is that you're also aware that you are going to have to write a game, which is on the one hand what everyone expects, but is somehow different than any game they have ever read. So you are going to have to surprise the reader who has read 10,000 of these games. Somehow you are going to have to write it in a way that, it's going to be both what they expected and not at all what they expected. And that's a tall order. And I have to say, I was very, very happy when I reached the end of my book. And I had that game behind me.
And I believe that Stephen King said you had, I don't know baseball terminology, you had batted a perfect game or hit one out of the park or something.
I was beyond thrilled to have passed muster with Stephen King. As you can imagine, he is an unbelievable baseball fan. And actually, I don't know that much about baseball. And I had been reading furiously and doing a lot of research. Which also I will say, as you can appreciate, Margot, is a tricky thing, because when you do a lot of research, there's always the danger that your book will sound researched, and that you will not internalize it enough so that it sounds natural. And it's especially true when you're doing as much research as I had to do. and so the whole idea that I had actually managed to do it and to pass muster with Stephen King, as well as I passed muster with Bill Nolan, who was Ted Williams' biographer, and with the great Jane Levy, who was the biographer of Mickey Mantle and Sandy Koufax and Babe Ruth. and the day I passed muster, I just feel like I'm done. I'm done.
So I can't help noticing that most of the names you're mentioning are men, and most of the writers of baseball novels are men. And so I wonder, were you really conscious of stepping into male territory? I mean, you're stepping into male territory, and so is Gwen, the girl with the golden arm in the Resistors.
Yes. It's one of the things, again, I didn't really think about it. I'd already launched myself off the cliff and I'm already midair. But, as I'm writing, it does occur to me that, of course, the great American baseball novel is very much male territory. So, it's Malamud, it's Updike, it's DeLillo, it's everybody. And it did occur to me that, the day might come when I actually did finish my book, and that, that at some level, some people in their heart of hearts are going to feel like, what is this middle-aged Asian American woman doing here on our turf? And that's why, that's one of the reasons it was so important to get every detail right. And baseball readers also are notoriously finicky. And, you miss one detail and your credibility is gone. So I did feel it. But of course, as I was, any time when I began to feel a little bit nervous, as one might, I just thought about, because I'd read every biography of every woman pitcher, so, that was Isla Jane Borders and Jackie Mitchell and Mamie Peanut Johnson and Monet Davis. And, those girls are up against so much more than a possible bad review. They were, and I felt like they were all right there with me. Do you know what I mean? And I feel like I was on their team and I could feel them rooting for me. And then I just felt like the same way they basically said, you know what? Here we are. Like it or not, here we are. I thought, well, like it or not, here I am.
And you do create an absolutely formidable picture in Gwen. Even though I know so little about baseball, I could appreciate that she was immensely focused and immensely accomplished. But I wanted to ask to move on to something else, another aspect of the resistors, and one that I found particularly fascinating. And it's just how easy it seemed it would be to get from our present world to your world. The novel is set in the future, but I don't think you specify a date. And many of the elements, the most distressing elements of Aunt Nettie's world, are already with us. Things like omniscient surveillance, extreme climate change, racism, sexism, how society treats its less useful members. In your novel, you use the rather wonderful word winnowing for what happens to the less useful people. They're all things we're already grappling with. So given our love affair with technology, it seems like we're just a silicon chip or two away from Aunt Nettie. And I think Anne Patchett described the resistors as a cautionary tale. Is that how you thought of it?
Well, yes, because, I was writing very much about kind of where we were and where we might be going. And of course, when you write a dystopia like this, the great hope is that people will look at where we could be going and stop and think again, so it's definitely a cautionary tale, and it's definitely a wake-up call, right? It's a way of saying, please let us not do this. People have said this book is very prescient, and of course at the time, I'm only just painting the possible horrors to come. I'm in no way predicting anything. And I have to say that I myself have been horrified at just how quickly some of the things in the book have come to pass. I mean, as you know, the class of non-productive people is called the surplus in my book. And as you say, they are being winnowed by the government. And, never in my wildest dreams would I imagine that the year my book came out, that, we would have all these people who are basically, left to die of COVID, that many people would feel that they are basically surplus. It's okay to winnow them. And I never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that something like this would come to pass so quickly. And neither would I've imagined that, the kinds of things that are going on with technology would have happened so quickly. Just the other day, I was talking to somebody who said that she was at a dinner party and they were talking about how much they loved handmade wooden bowls. And yes, their phones were in the room, but they were not on their phones, And next day they were barraged with ads for handmade wooden bowls. So it's, it's pretty creepy. And like I say, I did paint this horrifying picture, but I did imagine that it was some decades in the future. And I did not imagine that really by the time my book came out, that a lot of these things would be happening. As you know, also, the surplus, the unemployed are on a universal basic income, which the government is not too interested in maintaining indefinitely. And here we are already, with a government that is not too interested in extending unemployment indefinitely. I wish my book had not been so prescient.
No, I was going to say that I first read it with huge pleasure last autumn and have reread it in these last few days. And to reread it in our present circumstances was very distressing, as well as exhilarating and in some ways oddly cheerful. And that brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the world you create is horrifying, but there's also something oddly cozy about it. Grant and Gwen have this lovely garden, and Eleanor have this lovely garden, and Eleanor and Gwen knit these beautiful sweaters and blankets, and the baseball league itself is very cozy in a way. And then when Gwen goes off to university, they use the old-fashioned carrier pigeon to send messages back and forth. I mean, it could scarcely be more low-tech. And were you conscious of creating this kind of dichotomy or contrast?
Well, yeah, I think so. My book is a dystopia, but in the middle of it, it's a utopia, right?
Right.
So that, I guess, I've always been kind of a yin yang writer. I've always had that desire to have both poles in the book. And so, yes, we also have this utopia that, that oddly looks a lot like the life that a lot of people are leading right now. Of course, many people are having a very hard time with COVID and are leading very, very solitary lives. But there is definitely a cohort where they have their families around them, for extended periods of time for the first time in many, many years. And I myself am in that category, and where it is actually kind of idyllic. And so there is a weird way in which, Gwen and Eleanor and Grant seem that like they're in quarantine, right?
Yes,
and the same way that people now, everyone is doing a lot of knitting. And as you know, there are no seeds to be had because everybody is doing so much gardening. In any way, that's another way in which my book weirdly seems to describe our present condition. Like I say, and so there's this idyllic bubble, even as just outside of it, just horrors are coming to pass. Anyway, like I said, I wish it weren't true.
Another thing that the novel reminded me of was that it almost felt like a Shakespearean universe. The sense of hierarchy, the sense of a social order, the sense of a dark forest or a heath into which people got thrown out. And in the resistors, people get sent out into the water, yes, the rising waters. And I just was very struck by how many of the characters are sort of foils to each other. Eleanor is a heroic lawyer, and Grant, the narrator of the novel, is reticent and almost soft-spoken, one feels. And then there's Gwen, who is fiercely loyal and truthful, and Ondi, her best friend, who is much less loyal and much less truthful. And were you conscious of creating those pairings, if you will?
Yes, such a writerly question.
Yes, I had to get one.
And the answer is that, I will say that, one of the exercises that I will give to beginning writers, particularly ones who are having trouble generating rising action, is I will say, well, take two of something and put them in a room, in a closed space, right? So 2 brothers, 2 sisters, 2 roommates, 2 pets, but 2 of them, and they're not the same, and you will have conflict and you will have rising action. And so there's a way in which perhaps I've internalized my own, lesson. I think that, I've always had that yin yang tendency, as I've said, to include both poles of both the opposite of on any spectrum. I've always had that tendency to balance. But I will say that in something like this, I think that is particularly important because it helps render the world as kind of complete and a microcosm and believable. It does give a kind of cohesiveness to the novel that helps lend it credibility. So, because as you know, in something like this, you've got to think about how you're going to get people to actually believe this. And I do think that that kind of stitching really helps people believe it's real. Because in life, we have both poles, right? And therefore we recognize that. And like I said, I think most people just register it subconsciously. It's only fellow writers that would actually pick that out.
And I should say that one of the most sympathetic characters for me in the novel was the house, which talks and supervises and begins by seeming a little bit of a pain in the neck. It's always nagging, but ends up really sympathizing with Eleanor and Gwen and Grant in a wonderful way.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of fun with that house. I did have a lot of fun with the house. And, there is some suggestion that this house is being hand programmed, and right. That, it's not, that at times it is a program, but at times it's not a program. Yeah. And I think that this gets to the fact that, the technology, it seems so kind of its own thing. But actually, it's very much infused with the human. It's not nearly so separate from the human as maybe we sometimes think.
Like the wooden bowls.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Soon we're going to turn to our wonderful audience. So perhaps I can just ask you one last question. What are you working on now, and what are you reading now? If you feel capable of talking about either, they're rather intrusive questions.
Well, I will say that as it happens that Margot Livesey, I have actually just finished a new book. And Margot, you were very helpful to me, and I still appreciate your very generous reading of it. So I've just finished a new book, and I'm delighted to share that it was taken by Knopf today. Just a few hours ago. So I'm very happy about that. And I will also say that coincidentally, I have just been reading the most wonderful book, the most absorbing, fantastic book. It is about a group of children who find a boy in a field. He is injured. It is all very mysterious. And the book is about what happens to these three people and how this incident informs their life course from there on out. It is exceptionally well written. It is wise. It is beautiful. It is suspenseful. It is called The Boy in the Field, and it is by our own Margot Livesey, and it is coming out next week, I guess now. Is that right?
That's true, Gish. Yeah.
I can't wait, Margot. It's really one of the most wonderful things I've read in years.
I am honored. Thank you. And I think on that note, we should turn to our audience questions. I will be rephrasing some of these. To what extent was the resistors influenced by the Trump regime?
Oh. Well, as I was trying to say, I think from beginning to end by the Trump regime, I think that I was, I don't want to act like I'm some kind of prophetess, but I think from the beginning, it was clear that he was not really interested in rule of law as we understand it. And that he would, deploy, he would deform, our country, and that there were ways of his doing that. So I'm sorry to say that, like I say, I think democracy, freedom, I think was clear quite early on. That, it's not just that this is a Republican and maybe you have different ideas about Social Security or something. But I think it's clear quite early on that this was really very different. He's a very different kind of Republican president.
Thank you. The next question. Do you think technology can be reformed to respect and recognize the humanness you defend? Or is it, with its algorithms and its automation and surveillance, fundamentally incompatible with our more holistic qualities?
I actually think that that technology can and has already been used in very, very many ways, wonderful ways. I mean, for instance, if you want to know what's, who is going to in case of like child molesters and stuff like that, there's predictive technology that can help pinpoint, where there might be danger spots and protect people. So that, it has been used in wonderful ways. Actually, of course, it's been instrumental in bringing down the infection, the COVID rates in many countries. So, I don't think that we can look at technology as this kind of this enemy. I think that said, the potential, because any kind of very useful technology has a potential for destruction, right? So it's no different maybe than the railroads, right? I mean, there's a way in which many communities were ruined by railroads, but other things other things were given life by railroads. And what that looks like, though, is up to us. And I think what's important is not to just kind of stumble on blindly, and to really take a hard look at where we're going and what we're using the technology for. Make sure that that it serves us rather than we serve it.
This next questioner says, I love your book, Tiger Writing, and I love your book, Tiger Writing too, and the teapot analogy. Do you see any carryover from this to your new book?
Absolutely. I do think that there is a way in which when I look at this book and what a departure it is, as Margot was saying, I think that there's a way in which the Trump regime tripped me into this, but also I think that I was prepared to write from my more interdependent side by having written Tiger Writing and The Girl with the Baggage Claim. I think these books made me aware that, that one part of me was very individualistic. I grew up in the West, of course, and I'm steeped in the most individualistic of all projects, which is novel writing. But it made me aware that I actually have another side. And the side is not so interested in the self as the West defines it. It does not see the self as a kind of an avocado pit-like thing that does not change. And it is much more interested in, instead of being interested in categories and essences, it's much more interested in morphing and change and shape-shifting. And I think that that enabled me, I think, to embrace this kind of crazy book that did not have one category. It was not in one. It's extreme. It's anything but fixed. It's anything but categorizable. And I think that, like I say, I think that my nonfiction work kind of also helped fortify the idea that there were riches to be found in my Eastern side, and to kind of go ahead and use them. I don't know if that makes sense.
It completely does to me. The next question comes from someone who says, would the resistors be a good choice for two of my grandchildren who are smart and athletic? Girl age 13 plays soccer, likes dystopian fiction. 15-year-old boy plays baseball, lives and breathes it.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, I have to warn you that, the girl does Gwen does get involved with, I mean, there's a little Me Too stuff in this book. So I don't know about 13-year-olds, and there's a little Me Too stuff. Of course, these days, these kids are exposed to a lot more than I was as a child. So I don't know where the standards are anymore. I would certainly think that a 15-year-old interested in baseball would like this book quite a lot.
In your path to becoming a novelist, did you feel, or were you made to feel, that you must first hone your craft with short stories? Or is it possible for a beginning writer to start with either form and focus on following the story or stories rather than following a set path?
Oh, I don't think there's any set path. I mean, what do you think, Margot?
No,
I don't think there's any set path. That said, I think that it is true that, that these days, because of MFA programs and so on, that, most people, master the story first and then turn to the novel. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. And one of the reasons it makes sense is because you need quite a lot of structure to get people to get people through 300 pages.
Right.
And so if you don't have a really strong sense of structure, you may find that you will struggle with the longer form. And I think that to work in a shorter form first and sort of have some idea of what structure is, what is conflict, what is rising action, I think is helpful. That said, I don't think there are any rules about it. And I'm sure many a writer has sat down, never having written a short story, and has simply, lo and behold, understood the novel in some way, in some intuitive way, and just could do it.
Right. Yeah. In your book, rioting seems to be the answer to the oppressive government. Oh. Violence is their only option. But as things here in the real world become increasingly oppressive, do you feel we will finally have to resort to violence to create any real lasting change in the government? This is a sort of huge question, Gish.
I certainly hope not. I mean, although I do have a riot in my book, it is true that for me, as a person, I believe in nonviolence. I'm solidly in with John Lewis and that camp, and I do believe that nonviolent protests can get us there. That said, I do also think that people need to organize and make their voices heard.
Yeah.
But please, no baseball bats.
There are a number of writerly questions that I'm going to try to get to, but one question is non-writerly, but about the resistors. Was there a government in the world of resistors, or a government structure, or is Aunt Nettie the government?
Oh, that's interesting. I always imagined that there was a government behind Aunt Nettie. But in this book, it's actually, they are not really aware of that government. Do you know what I mean? In other words, it's back there somewhere, but they're really only aware of Aunt Nettie. And it's not clear who runs Aunt Nettie if there are people exactly running Aunt Nettie. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's not clear whether Aunt Nettie is actually also running them, And I guess it's some kind of, we talk about the military-industrial complex. It's some kind of digital governmental complex that's very decentralized, I guess, and it's just not clear.
And a number of people ask about advice for writers just starting out. How to write, how to get attention for the work, how to write particularly during the pandemic and all the distractions thereof.
Well,
I've sort of grouped together a number of questions here.
Let me just say that I don't think that there's any answer. How to start writing or anything like that. And I don't really know how to answer those things. As much advice as and Margot, please do chime in, because I know you've been asked this question probably 900 times as well. My own advice to writers is, number one, just simply glue your behind to a chair, hand on the keyboard, same time every day, keep your fingers moving. Do not think about what you're doing so much, because a lot of people have writer's block. I think that if you actually simply develop the habit of sitting down every day and just having your hand on the keyboard, do not wait for inspiration. I would say just do it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, this whole idea that the pandemic is distracting, the answer, the pandemic is a gift to writers. And do not, if you are being distracted, you are allowing yourself to be distracted. The answer is that, life is full of distractions. There are always distractions. It is one of our jobs to turn it off, and do not be distracted by the pandemic. Look, we all want it to end, but from a writer's point of view, this is a great golden moment, and I urge every writer to please take the greatest advantage of it. Don't you think, Margot?
I completely do. We are the fortunate ones. We can keep writing, whereas many people can't keep acting or playing their trombone or ice skating at this time. So
that is right. We are the lucky ones. So exactly. Just look over your shoulder at your poor fellow artists. Say, I am so sorry. Oh my God, I'm a writer. Bottom to the chair, hands on the keyboard.
Is there a genre that you haven't written in yet that you'd like to explore, i.e. horror, romance, though Mona is a kind of romance, as is World and Town and even Typical American. Would you like to write more speculative fiction?
I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not going down some list of genres and thinking about, oh, well, I should do that. It really has to do with what moves me. I mean, as you can sort of see, like in this case, I ended up writing a dystopia because of the moment I found myself in, which is the moment we're all in. And it was my way of coping with something which I saw happening around me. And so it's not so much that I know what the genre will be, so much as there will be something about a moment which compels me, and then I will look for whatever form might be appropriate.
And we should say that your new book, your wonderful new book is, oh, shush. You shouldn't say anything about it? Okay. I took that.
It's too early to start talking about it, I'm afraid.
Okay. Let me switch immediately to another question. Does your daughter read your novels or any novels? As a literature professor, I worry that all discussions about fiction are attended by people our age.
Well, I don't think my daughter is attending this discussion. You want to know that. But she actually does read novels. She's not an English major and she's not intending to go into literature, but she does read novels. She's always asking me for recommendations. Loves Ishiguro, loves E.B. White. E.B. White's not a novelist, but I mean, she does definitely read and enjoy reading. So I don't think all is lost. That said, certainly this is not the golden age of the printed page. And, but a surprising number of people have told me during COVID that they're all reading. So, I mean, the same way that we have this kind of return to knitting and gardening, I think that with knitting and gardening actually goes reading. And I actually just saw an article in Publishers Weekly that, that the publishers are doing well now. People are buying books and people are returning to the page. And hopefully they will, once they've rediscovered it, they will continue to read and understand that there's a kind of sustenance in the literary works that they do not find, in Netflix. You know what I mean? It's a different thing. The same way that, you can buy a sweater, it's different than when you knit a sweater. And when you read a book, it's different than taking in something on the screen. And I'm hoping that now people will realize that.
How do you feel about audiobooks?
Oh, I think audiobooks are great, Yeah. I mean, if not, we spend so much time in cars. And, I think that it's great that that we have audiobooks now to be with us. And no, I think they're great. I think that and a surprising number of people will read the audiobook and also read the book. It's funny, people definitely do both. And which I'm very, very much in support of also. It's a particular joy when you hear, a writer actually read their own work. I think the first time that I had this experience was with Grace Paley, and just reading, listening to Grace Paley read her own work. It was just, it's a revelation. Similar, that's true too of Eudora Welty. The first time I heard Eudora Welty read, it was just like, oh my God, I felt like I actually had completely missed her stories, really. So it can be a wonderful thing.
Several people ask variations of a question, which is really, how do I get to be Gish Jen? Or
Margot Livesey.
Or to put it in another way, what was your sort of career path to writing? Not the sitting in a chair part, but
Oh, I see.
the
What-
other part.
what
Yes.
happened?
Yes.
Well, Margot, you should really weigh on this too. I don't think there's any one way. I think it's, in fact, I'm hard pressed to think of two writers whose careers have proceeded in the same way.
Yeah.
I was very, very, very late coming to writing, and that had its problems. But maybe one thing good about it was that by the time I actually was able to sit down, I actually had something to say. I had actually lived a lot of life, and I'd had a lot of thoughts about it. And so there's a way in which maybe I had more stuff to put into first novel than maybe was typical. Maybe that I would have had if I was 21. I would not have picked such a late start, on purpose, but it probably was a good thing for me. And in my case, just from the nuts and bolts point of view, back then you would publish in literary magazines, and agents would see your story and write to you. And I don't know what you did, Marco. I just took all the names of the agents, I put them all in a folder, I wrote them all back, and I said, I'll write you back when I have something. Thank you very much for your interest. And when I had my first novel, I took all the names out and I wrote to them all, and I said, I now have a novel. Do you want to see it? And then they wrote to me and they said yes. And then it was very easy. Things are very much more complicated partly because the literary magazines are struggling. There are fewer of them, and so I just think, I don't know. My whole career has been very atypical. But Margot, why don't you talk about how you became Margot Livesey, which I would love to know.
I did not do an MFA. I waitressed and I wrote stories between lunch and dinner. And I started sending those stories to literary magazines. And when a number of them had been published, I saw an interview in a Canadian newspaper with an editor. And I wrote to her and said, I write stories. Would you like to publish them? And I think she thought it came from a small child. But after 6 months, she wrote back and said, write some more stories and then we can talk about it. So
again, I'm kind of a Cinderella story. I mean, it's like a fairy tale, and so
not typical.
You can tell anybody to, in order to be Margot Livesey, this is what you should do. And the answer is, I think that there's a gazillion ways to find a way to interprint, and there's no one answer.
Yeah.
And a lot of serendipity.
Yeah. We just have time for a couple more questions. Do you write poetry, and would you consider it?
Oh, that's interesting. I actually started out in poetry as an undergrad. So when I was, so I did go to Harvard, and when I was a junior, I took this class, which is in versification with Robert Fitzgerald, the translator. At the time, I thought I would take it because I was an English major and I didn't really understand why poetry is written in those little lines. I said, why don't they just say what they mean, right? I said, I thought if I take this class, I will know. It was called English 183. And Fitzgerald did tell us that there would be a weekly exercise. He did not say it was going to be a weekly exercise in verse, so I didn't realize. And so the first assignment came through. We were supposed to write something in Catalan hedicasyllables, and I was just like, oh my God, I was to write a poem. Anyway, it was chopping period, you could still drop, so I thought, I'll try it, and I immediately loved it, I have to say. I immediately loved it. And I did tell my roommate, I said, God, I love this. If I could do this for the rest of my life, I would. And so poetry was my first love, but it soon became apparent that many of my poems were narrative. I was not a lyric writer. I loved narrative poetry, and so it was kind of a very natural thing to move from there into the story.
And someone asks a rather mysterious question, but I hope it will mean something to you. Do you think your Kirkland House experience informed your writing career in any way?
Oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about that. Well, that's kind of funny because Kirkland House back then, so I graduated in 1977. And back in the day, Kirkland House was the jock house. I hadn't even thought of it until this very minute, but actually, that's another way in which I'm actually quite familiar with sports culture. It is through Kirkland House, and I myself actually, was a jock of sorts. I wrote crew. So now that I think about it, I can, I'm sure if I think about it some more, I will think, but maybe the whole idea, kind of an interest in sports, and understanding that it was very much part of our society, that, it's not a set apart segment of the world. It's just, it's a segment that's very much infused by all the things that we experience, that it's a kind of mirror, it's kind of a special mirror, sports, of who we are. And I think that maybe some of those ideas did come from my experience in Kirkland House.
And I think that is a wonderful note on which to end, and to thank you, Gish, for this wonderful discussion and your illuminating answers. I've learned so much about you today, and I thought I knew you pretty well already. And I think Kisa is now going to take over.
Thank you so much, Margot. It was so good of you to do this, and so much luck on your new book.
Thank you.
So thank you to Gish and Margot for a wonderful discussion. I'm sure we could all have listened to you for another hour. And thank you also to the audience for your wonderful questions. Let me just conclude with two points. One is that in the chat section of the Zoom, you have information about Gish's book, The Resistors, as well as to Margot's forthcoming book, The Boy in the Field. So for those who haven't read Gish's book yet and who are looking forward to reading Margot's book, I encourage you to go check out that information in the chat. And second, I want to invite you all to join us for the final book talk of our summer series, which will be next Tuesday, August 11th, with Alelia Bundles, who is the author of Self-Made, Inspired by the Life of Madame C.J. Walker. The original title of that book was On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madame C.J. Walker. This is a book that was the inspiration for Self-Made, the fictional 4-part Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. So for more information about our upcoming events and videos of our past programs, please go to radcliffe.harvard.edu. So thank you again for joining us today. Goodbye.